Hello class, and welcome back to another lecture. This week we're going to be talking about social movements and the media, how claims makers create social movements and how the media distributes these claims. So essentially what we're going to be looking at this week is how social problems become defined as social problems in the first place, how groups that want to organize to make social change can create a frame that makes their claims something that the dominant culture will consider integrating into its general normative structure, and how the media plays a role in making those claims credible and making them actually integrated into that culture, or not, how they might package those claims differently. So let's get started. Part 1, Theories of Social Movements. Here we're just going to talk about how sociologists have conceived of social movements over time and how that's changed. To begin with, let's go over a few of the early social movement theories. We're not going to go into any of these in incredible depth, at least not these theories. But here just gives you an idea of how sociologists started out thinking about social movements and why that is dramatically different from the way we talk about social movements today. Early theories of social movements, like collective behavior theory, thought of social movements not so much in terms of the movement they produce, but in terms of how people behaved when they collected together in crowds. So this theory is old, early to mid-1900s. So as we learned earlier in the class, this is when sociology was really blossoming as a discipline. Here, sociologists were talking about collective behavior in terms of how people behaved when they gathered together. And the general theme of this theory was that when people gather together in crowds, that their behavior essentially becomes irrational. They take on a kind of mob mentality. You've probably heard this concept yourself in popular culture, the idea of a mob mentality, that when people are together, the collective emotions of the group overtakes the individual and makes them do what might be considered irrational, strange, and destructive things. You've probably even seen this depicted in films or in television shows. It's still a popular idea today. Sociologists broadly consider this theory to be insufficient to describe how people really gather together and really make change. This is an oversimplification. Later, this theory sort of developed into mass society theory, very similar to collective behavior theory. This was sort of a response to World War II in the 1930s and 1940s. So in World War II, as you all know, there were massive atrocities in terms of attacks on human rights, right? So we know about World War II, we know about Adolf Hitler rising to power and systematically murdering the Jews in Germany. We've also talked a little bit in this class about how genocide took place in the United States, but through different means. In the prison system, prisoners were being labeled as being genetically defective, which again is not something that's supported today, that there's no genetic link between crime. There's nothing genetic that makes a person a criminal, right? That those are social processes. But during that time, because of those beliefs, there was genocide, and there was a lot of behavior that, particularly looking at the Germans from the perspective of the United States, behavior that was being seen as wildly irrational, and I mean, indeed, you can say these were horrible actions. So if you want to call them irrational today, you can. But sociologists, rather than framing them in terms of rationality and irrationality today, we talk about how movements come to collectively construct these ideas. But that's not what they were saying then. Then they were trying, with mass society theory, to say that mass society referring to contemporary society where there are a lot more people than there were previously, and where all these people need to be organized in terms of more and more detailed bureaucracies, that having all of these people centralized in one place was leading to anomie. Anomie, we learned, is Durkheim's term that he uses to describe societies that have a loss of norms. So people are less connected together to each other, even though they're all in one place. They have less normative structure. And so the theory here was that in these mass societies, people are going to behave in ways that are similar to what collective behavior theory was saying, that people are going to be irrational, they're going to embrace destructive behavior, Not this time because of a mob mentality, but because they're disconnected from society. That's the main difference. It's the disconnection rather than the binding together connection that was the theme in collective behavior theory. We talked about Zimbardo's study earlier in the semester as well. We talked about how people, according to Zimbardo, might engage in really destructive behaviors that are oppressive and cruel because they're put into positions of authority because of the way society organizes them. Now, that was in the 1970s, so this is considerably later. The reason I bring it up is because the mentality is similar. So if you're understanding Zimbardo's study and his theories, then you have at least some idea of how mass society theory works. Not exactly the same. There are differences, but that's the theme, right? Relative deprivation theory is a theory that succeeded those as well. This is not a complete list of social movement theories either. I should point out these are just a few theories. Relative deprivation theory postulates a very intuitive idea that movements emerge as a response to social injustice, right? So there's something actually happening in society whereby one group is doing better than another, is benefiting in a way that another group is hurt. They're deprived of having something that another group has. One key thing to note here is that it's not just about having very little or being deprived in general, but that it's being deprived relative to another group. So if a group perceives that they've lost something in response to another group gaining something, that they might experience relative deprivation theory. This has been used to explain both groups that we describe today as being oppressed, like racial minorities, but also dominant culture groups, right? So if conservative groups, for example, believe erroneously is what sociologists would say, again, based on what we learned in the course, erroneously that they're losing power as minorities are gaining power, they might believe that they have relative deprivation, and so this theory might apply to them. So if a group perceives that they're losing something, that they are going to emerge as a response to this injustice, right? That something has happened to them. And another thing to point out, too, is that this perception, according to this theory, happens because there is a real deprivation of some kind. So, yeah, conservatives might erroneously believe that they're being deprived in society in general, but it would be a response to something that actually happened that maybe helped minorities out to even out inequality or something. But something real has happened, right? So status discontent is a term that's used to refer to when a group sees their status as being socially treated as inferior to another one, or they have less resources with respect to another one. But the reason I'm pointing this out is because this is an objectivist view of social movements. Now, what does objectivist mean? Objectivist means that we are acting as if there is something real that's happening in the world that is objective. There is some physical thing that has happened, and that physical thing that has happened is objectively a problem. Whether we define it as a problem or not, it is a real problem, right? And the reason I point this out is because later theories we're going to see don't have this objectivist view. Social problems are not necessarily problems just because they exist, but because we define them as existing. Now, we'll talk about that more in a second. But the common theme of these theories is that movements are either irrational and dysfunctional for society, right, like collective behavior theory and mob mentality, that people are coming together and they're behaving irrationally and it hurts the social system or it hurts themselves, right? Or a movement is behaving rationally and reasonably because it's based on some objective problem that exists out there. Something has happened, that thing is objectively bad, and people respond. Here are a couple more theories on what makes a social movement happen. Just a quick overview of how they work. Again, we're not going into a lot of depth on every single one of these theories. We're going to expand a few of them. But one of these is rational choice theory. So these rational choice theory of social movements postulate that movements emerge as individual actors behave in their best collective interests. Rational choice theories are interesting in that, unlike most of what we've learned in sociology, It's very much individualistic. Mostly we've been talking about things in terms of micro-level processes, macro-level processes, and even when we talk about micro-level processes, we're usually talking about social construction, people working together to define a situation as real, right? Rational choice theory is a little bit more psychological in nature, the idea being that every individual can be expected to behave in ways that will maximize their own self-interest. So they're going to want to minimize costs and maximize benefits. And when you create mathematical social models of many people engaging in the same behavior at once, then you can predict the behavior of the crowd. That's the central premise of rational choice theories. The difficulty of rational choice theories is that there's sort of a problem in using these theories to explain social movements, because as we're going to see in a minute, social movements require a lot of participation from individuals to succeed. That participation comes with a cost, and social movements are not guaranteed to create a benefit for all members of the group. And in fact, people who are part of social movements can put in more or less effort, and they can only expect to receive the same amount of benefit regardless of how much effort they put in. And that creates a kind of dilemma. I'll explain more in a minute. These theories were most influential in the 1980s and 1990s. Today, they're not really employed to explain social movements. They're often used as a way of contrasting an earlier theory to explain how modern theories are different. Usually, if you read a book on modern social theories, it'll bring up rational choice theories almost as a way of debunking those theories, as a way of saying, okay, if we treat people just as rational actors and nothing else, then we're going to miss some important processes of how social movements work. That's not to say that people don't act in their own interest to some degree. These rational choice theories have produced models that are very useful. But sociologists today believe these are incomplete models and that there are significant problems in employing them for this purpose. Another theory of social movements is resource mobilization theory. Another fairly intuitive premise. The idea is that movements emerge when people have sufficient means to collect resources. This theory is designed to address an issue that comes up when we look at relative deprivation theory. So that was the theory on the previous slide. On that slide, we said that when there's an objective problem in society, people are going to mobilize to fight it. So take the civil rights movement, for example. With Jim Crow laws, Black Americans were being oppressed severely, right? So it makes sense in light of severe oppression that they would band together, create a social movement to fight that. They would fight it and make social change. That's intuitive. However, we can also see that even in that same example, that's not always the case. A group can have quite a lot of members, be quite technically powerful in the sense that there's a lot of people who are part of that movement, and still not actually emerge as a social movement, right? And resource mobilization theory is one way of explaining why. And the theories we're going to explore later complete that puzzle and give you more information on this, but so in the case of Black Americans, the Civil Rights Movement happened in the 1960s, and the oppression of African Americans in this country goes back much, much further than the 60s, as we've seen. So why did African Americans not rise up sooner to create a coherent social movement? One way you could explain this is by looking at resource mobilization theory and saying, did the people who were being oppressed have sufficient resources to fight? Part of this is having material resources, money and physical capital. When you have those things, you can build a social movement. That's intuitive enough. And they did not always have that, right? They need moral resources as well. So this means social solidarity and collective support for the movement's goals. That may have existed in different groups, but as we've also seen, there are some barriers that are put into place that make it difficult for there to be solidarity among oppressed groups broadly in our culture. We've talked a little bit about some of those. Again, we'll expand in a minute. Social organizational resources. So these are organizational strategies, social networks, block recruitment. So basically the ability to actually bring people together to organize is a resource in and of itself, right? We need people who emerge who can provide some kind of strategy and others who can get on board with that strategy. That's a kind of resource. If people can't do that, they can't collect. There's human resources, which simply means the people themselves who are willing to give their time and energy to a cause in spite of the costs that come with that. And then there are cultural resources, which is basically like what we learned about the dominant culture. Is there something in the culture that makes mobilization easier, right? So today we have a cultural resource. For example, we have the term racism. That term emerged as a result of social movements fighting for justice for African Americans, and before there was a concept of racism, before there was a concept that a person could be unjust by discriminating or by being prejudiced, that resource didn't exist. Now, groups can draw on that resource when they want to. They can say racism is happening, and the culture can say, ah, yes, racism is something that's wrong, and they can engage that movement. Agreement, disagreement, whatever. They still acknowledge racism as being a cultural phenomenon, right? So those are different resources. So why do groups sometimes experience deprivation, severe deprivation, and they can't form a social movement? It's because they're lacking in one or more of these resources. You could apply this to impoverished today, regardless of race or gender or other statuses. There are many who would say, okay, the majority of people in the world are in poverty. In each respective country, there's more impoverished than there are people who are well off. Why don't they band together and fight that injustice? Well, when a person is impoverished, they often don't have a lot of time, for one thing. They're working multiple jobs, they've got a family to support. They don't have what some might call the privilege of being able to collect together. And so that would mean that they lack other resources as well. It's hard to have moral resources when you can't band together, solidarity, right? It's hard to gain social organizational resources because again, you need one sort of precedes the other there. Moral resources are necessary for social organizational resources. They're tied together. Human resources, what I already described, the ability to band, there being people who have the free time to do that. And cultural resources, which would be elements in the dominant culture that give people who are in poverty a sense that some leverage that they can use to gain traction, right? Okay, so that's resource mobilization theory in a nutshell. The common theme of these social movements is that when movements are rational, they succeed or fail based on objective physical constraints and freedoms. So the reason I'm pointing out this common theme is because I want to point out that things are getting a little bit more social construction-y, but we're still sort of in the realm of rationality. We're still in a world where social problems are assumed to exist and to be real, regardless of whether we define them as real or not, regardless of what the culture says. They're real problems, and those real problems are what cause social movements. The real problems themselves are direct causes. So now I'm going to take a moment to backtrack and zoom in on our rational choice theories. Rational action theories is another way of saying the same thing. So I mentioned that rational choice theories are not really employed much to explain social movements today. But in spite of that, it's worth talking about because the dilemmas that rational action theories present need to be addressed by modern theories. Because rational action theory is useful for explaining a lot of things, and because if we don't find some way to engage these claims, then how can we make our new claims? We need to either support or find contrary evidence to this theory since it's been established and since evidence has been found in its favor, right? And as I said, this theory is often challenged, so I need to present for you evidence for this, right? Why is rational action theory challenged? And the answer to that question determines what we need to do for modern social movement theories in order to correct for that. So the biggest issue with rational choice theories, this idea that actors behave in their best interest, is what's known as the free rider problem. So in a social movement, actors, individuals, they got to contribute their time and resources in order to affect common social change. Some actors will contribute more than others and less than others, but all reap the same benefits. So rational action theories postulate that we all always act in our best interests all the time, right? But it's never really in our best interest to contribute a lot to a social movement. It's in our best interest to be part of a social movement so that we can reap the benefits. But being part of a social movement, for any given member, it's in our best interest to minimize the amount of effort that we put into that social movement, right? So we would want to join, but we wouldn't want to contribute. Now, the paradox is, if people are always acting in their best interest, how can a social movement move forward? Everyone would be essentially, quote-unquote, free riding off the system. This is known as the free rider problem. Probably one of the more intuitive examples of a free rider idea comes from your own classes, right? I'm sure at some point you've been given a group project in one of your classes. And one of the biggest social contentions of group projects is, okay, who's going to contribute the most, who's going to contribute the least? We're all afraid of group projects because we're afraid that we're going to get someone in our group who's just going to not contribute or do any work and that they're going to get a good grade anyway, right? I've heard students say this over and over. When I was a student, it was something I worried about. How much do I contribute to a group project so that I'm getting a correct moral benefit from it, right? If I'm putting in too much effort and others aren't putting in a lot of effort, I feel gypped. If I'm putting in a little bit of effort, then I'm wronging the other people in the group, right? But according to rational action theories, it only makes sense for a person to put in very little so that other people will put in a lot and that they can reap that benefit. So all of us are going to want to minimize how much we contribute. But if everyone did that, then there would be no good group projects. Everyone would fail their projects. Same concept with social movement theories. If it's true that everyone's putting in minimal effort, then we shouldn't expect to see successful social movements at all, but in fact we do. So this is a paradox. How do we resolve this? I'm going to show a video on the next slide that explains the free rider problem in more detail and gives a little bit of a sort of semi-mathematical explanation as to why this really is a paradox and how it can be applied to the real world. And then after that, we're going to revisit this and talk about what are some of the ways that rational action theory has been responded to in modern movement theories.
Let's say Mr. Blue and Miss Red have each been arrested for some minor crime. The police think they committed a more serious crime, but they don't have enough evidence to convict them. They need a confession. They take them and put them in separate rooms so they can't talk, and play a little game. To try to force a confession, the police give them each a choice. Admit your partner committed the crime and you will go free. We'll pardon you for the minor crime, but your partner will have to spend 3 years in prison. If you stay silent and your partner lets us know that you were the one who really did it, then you're gonna have to go away for 3 years. They know that the police don't have any evidence, and if they both stay silent, then they will only go to prison 1 year each for the minor crime. If they both betray each other, then they'll both go to prison for 2 years each. Okay, each partner can do one of two things: stay silent or betray. Staying silent would be cooperating, and betraying would be defecting. If they both stay silent, then they each spend a year in prison. If one betrays and the other stays silent, then the betrayer goes free and the silent spends 3 years in prison. If they both betray, then it's 2 years each. So what are they going to do? Well, they should cooperate. That's the best option for the group, if we add the total number of years in prison. But let's take it from Red's perspective. If she thinks Blue is going to stay silent, then she should betray so she can go free. Going free is better than spending a year in prison. If she thinks he's going to betray her, then she should definitely betray. 2 years in jail is better than 3 and being made a fool of. Blue is in the exact same situation and will think the exact same thing. He should betray if she stays silent, and he should betray if she betrays. They should have both cooperated, but from an individual standpoint, they notice they could always gain by defecting, if they have no control over what the other person's gonna do. So they'll both defect to try to better their own situation, but come away not only hurting the group, but themselves. Individually, they're worse off than if they both cooperated. This situation is pretty made up, but it has some real-world analogs. A common example is with marketing. Let's say 2 cigarette companies, Red Strikes and Smooth Blue, are deciding how much money they should spend on advertising. Since the product they each make is identical to one another, advertising has a huge impact on sales. For simplicity, let's say their choices are to advertise a bunch or not advertise at all. And there's just 100 people in the society and they all smoke. If both don't advertise, then just by random chance picking cigarette boxes, 50 people buy Red Strikes and 50 people buy Smooth Blue. At $2 a pack, they each make $100. Let's say advertising costs $30. If one person advertises and the other does not, then 80 people will buy the cigarettes from the ads and 20 people buy the other ones. The advertiser makes $160 minus $30 for ads and comes away with $130. The non-advertiser didn't spend any money but only made $40. If they both advertise, again, half will buy Red Strikes and half will buy Smooth Blue. But since they both spent $30 on advertising, they only come away with $70 each. Same deal, both people cooperating and not advertising is the most preferable situation, but both companies can see that advertising will always make them more money. But unlike the prisoners in jail, these companies can talk and try to influence each other. From here, Blue would be better off if Red didn't advertise. Red wouldn't go for that because that would be worse for them. Blue could try to convince Red that they would both not advertise, the only other situation where they're both better off. But without any real obligation to each other, there's nothing that's stopping them from trying to advertise to gain more of the market anyway. If you think your opponent's gonna not advertise, then you're better off advertising. Although we're still making assumptions to make this situation work too. With this model, we're assuming they only play once. The game changes when the players have a chance to build a relationship and work together to get more gains over time, or punish each other by not cooperating. Also, to make the model work, we have to make up rules for the players. Assume they're basically computer programs with predictable actions. These guys are creepier than they were in my head. They were supposed to be cute. For the Prisoner's Dilemma and other similar models, we're assuming they are rational agents. A rational agent is a hypothetical person that will always pick the option that they predict will work out best for them. They're not really thinking about the gains of someone else. Seems selfish, but it is something that real people generally do too. People always want what's best for themselves, and we don't like to be made a fool of. But if you put real people in the Prisoner's Dilemma, people don't always defect like the model predicts. In one study, 40 people playing Prisoner's Dilemma games through a computer without ever meeting or talking, only playing each opponent once, these are one-off games, using a payoff matrix that looks like this, cooperated an average of 22% of the time. These people never cooperated, these people always cooperated, these guys cooperated on half of their games and everyone else is in between. This is a lot of cooperation coming from a model that predicts no cooperation. The largest group did act like rational agents, but most people tried to cooperate at least once. It's because, well, there's more to real people. We are social creatures, and even in one-off scenarios with no guarantees or obligations and no chance to build a relationship, we're still thinking about how the group might decide. We're actually thinking from the perspective of the group and making an optimistic decision. Cooperating an average of 20% of the time might not seem very optimistic, but remember this is with absolutely no communication or obligations. Anyways, that's not really the point. Using rational agents is still useful. The model is just trying to point out the dilemma of certain situations where people are actually hurting themselves when counterintuitively they're only thinking about themselves. And that's why we're modeling using the cold robotic psychopaths.
Okay, so now we've seen a little bit about rational action theories of social movements and some of the issues with those. So now we're going to talk about a response to previous theories, modern social movement theories. Specifically, we're going to talk about new social movement theory. So here in the slide it says new social movements, but that's not referring to just new social movements. It's referring to the kind of theory. It's literally called new social movement theory. New social movement theory, while it's not the only theory that's embraced now, all of the other theories are still active in sociology. Sociologists haven't discarded the other lenses. They're still used. This one is the most modern and it is popular, and it is social constructionist in perspective. So rather than treating social issues as being objectively existing, so the previous models that we looked at were objectivist in nature. They're issues that exist out there, right? New social movements theory instead comes from a position of subjectivism. The idea being that, yes, of course, there are objective social conditions in the world. And, you know, whether there's inequality, that's objective as well. Yes, no one disputes that. But new social movements theory approaches the issue by saying what makes something a social problem isn't that there are objective circumstances. We can observe the fact that there's inequality, but what makes it a social problem is when people collectively agree that it's a social problem. There are plenty of times that inequality, injustice, or harm simply never come under the umbrella of being considered social problems by a society. And because of that, it wouldn't make sense for us to call them social problems. They're not part of our consciousness as a culture. So new social movements theory says, okay, once a group has organized under an issue, once they've defined an issue as being a problem, given it a name, given it a frame, giving it a way to talk about it and the culture a way to discuss it, then the objective circumstance becomes a social problem. So in other words, a movement emerges when a group can produce a common definition of the situation. So a group of people have to come together. They have to identify some objective circumstance. They have to decide that it is a problem, and they have to develop ways of talking about that social issue that frame it as an issue, that's something that needs to be rectified. And they do that through the social constructionist processes we've been talking about throughout class, the way you and I all negotiate the definition of the situation, collectively contribute to it. So they'll have conversations, they'll have meetings, they'll talk about the social problem, and they'll do some specific things in order to make the problem more reified. So reified is a term that means to make something real. So I'm not making an argument that things start out as not real and then become real. That's not how social construction works. But with social construction, things become a real part of our subjective reality. They become part of our social world when we talk about them, when we give them definition and features. So that's the approach here. So I've used the term framing a number of times, so I'll need to elaborate on that. Framing is a way of talking about a situation. It is the presentation of a situation in a way that encourages certain interpretations of the situation and discourages others. So in other words, when we present something to someone else, when we present something to an audience, we do it in a way that makes certain interpretations of what's going on seem plausible, seem reasonable, and others seem not so plausible and more unreasonable. Let me give an example. So imagine for a moment that you came into a classroom, that you came into a sociology class, and in the middle of the classroom where there were meant to be all of the desks and chairs, there was just a large missing patch where there's just no desks and no chairs, nowhere to sit down. There's only a few chairs for a few people, and there's no real place for students to go. So naturally, as students, you would probably look to the instructor to see what was going on, to get a feel for what is the definition of the situation here. How are we meant to interpret this? That makes sense because in a classroom, that's essentially the way that dynamic is designed to work. You're designed to show up in the classroom, and your job as a student, is to look at the instructor and get information from them about what constitutes an appropriate way to interpret situations. So let's say this happened in my classroom, and let's say that I, as an instructor, said something like, okay, this is an activity that we're all going to engage in today. We are going to work together to figure out how to navigate this issue with the desks, and this is a team building exercise, and we're all going to problem solve this together and find a way to make an effective classroom in spite of our limitations, right? So I framed the situation as something that's positive, and I framed the problem as our ability to work together and make the classroom work anyway. So that becomes the center of focus. That means that your interpretation of the situation, what seems reasonable to you at that point, is it seems reasonable to assume that what's happening here, that is it's an activity you might potentially be graded, or it's an opportunity to show your excellent learning skills. It's a challenge to be overcome. It's a fun exercise to enjoy. Those interpretations all make sense. If instead we came into the classroom and I became very upset and I started lecturing to you students, since I'm a sociology instructor and we talk about inequality all the time, about how the school is taking resources and giving students less and less resources for their classes, and even though you've come here and paid for your schooling, the school is denying you as students your ability to have the proper resources to learn. You're not going to get as good of an education when you're constantly being robbed of resources. I would be framing it as an injustice to you as students. At that point, if we carried on through class, you would not see it as a reasonable interpretation of the situation for you to engage in a kind of game-like discussion about, okay, how should we put the class together? How should we make this work? Instead, your interpretation would be, something's gone wrong in the school. I'm personally being injured by this. And what's interesting about those two different framings is it makes completely different actions seem possible for you as a student. Under the first frame, it doesn't seem possible that you could all band together and protest, right? You could, absolutely, there'd be nothing stopping you. But with me as an instructor presenting this to you as a game, as a kind of challenge to be overcome, that would seem fairly absurd. You would have a hard time getting your classmates on board. But if instead you entered the classroom and I framed it as an injustice the school was doing to you, and I gave you reasons, I said, well, your money that you're paying for your education is being wasted. You're not receiving the value of that education. I am no longer able to teach you effectively. And I framed it as a kind of emergency, right? Now it becomes totally reasonable for you to conclude that the best thing to do is to protest or to go to the authorities in the school, the dean or the whoever's in charge of financing, to find out who arranges the bureaucratic decisions associated with where money is spent, right? All those actions now make sense. And so that all becomes possible. So the frame is a way of presenting the issue so that it sets up the possibility for a certain definition of the situation. It sets up the possibility for certain kinds of actions, and it closes doors to other kinds of actions. An injustice frame, I have here bolded as a vocabulary word, is a kind of frame. It is a frame where you're defining a situation as unjust and in need of rectification. So in the example I gave, the first frame is not an injustice frame. It's just a frame. You could give it another name if you wanted to. But basically I'm framing the situation as a kind of game or a kind of exercise. But once you build an injustice frame, that is the foundation of a social movement. That makes it possible to start organizing for collective action. And building an injustice frame is therefore a very important step for social movements to take in order to make change. They have to build an injustice frame. They have to find a way to define the situation so that it seems that something unjust is happening, and that unjust thing needs to be presented in such a way so as to make certain kinds of actions to rectify the situation seem possible and reasonable. I put here as a bullet point, grievances are transformed into demands. So in the case of the desks being missing, your grievance of having a difficult classroom to learn in becomes a demand of, we need to receive our resources. Another thing that excuse me, that modern theory emphasizes, new social movements theory, not just modern theory. Again, this movement theory is called new social movements theory, is the creation of a shared identity, subcultural identity theory, right? So in rational choice theories, we saw that people are postulated to act as individuals. And so why on earth would an individual behave in a way that would that it serves their best interest? Well, why would they behave in a way that goes counter to their best interests in order to fuel a movement? Well, the idea here is that when people share an identity, when they all think of themselves as belonging to a social movement, then the costs associated with participating in that movement don't seem like individual costs. They seem like group costs. So another way to think of this is that the group now has a sense of shared fate and shared identity. It's not so much about how much effort should I put in and how much effort will I get out. The idea is that my identity is bound up in that group. So let's say I joined a social movement that was a religious social movement, right? So we are the, I don't know, I'm just going to make up a Christian offshoot. We're the New Age 2019 Christians. 2019 is when I'm first recording this lecture. If I reuse this lecture, forgive me. But yeah, let's say that we're the 2019 Christians, right? So now that means that when we make decisions and when we invest in that group, when we invest in our decision-making process, that we are that we feel that we are going to all benefit as a group from that investment, that you identify with the actions that are taken as part of that group, right? Okay. So now I want to talk about the social problems process. I've talked about frames. I've talked about having a shared identity. We've talked about the fact that this is a subjectivist view of social movements, that it's not about what's objectively out there. The social problems process is a specific series of steps that a social movement can take in order to become influential. So on the next slide, we're going to go through that order of the social problems process. The reason I'm putting it on this slide is basically just to emphasize this process that Joel Best outlines and that I'm going to explain to you is consistent with new social movement theory. It takes as its basic assumption the idea that groups form collective identities. They have a shared sense of fate, that they're invested in an issue, and that with that shared identity, that is what makes these steps possible. All right, that brings us to part 2, the social problems process. The social problems process, as outlined by Joel Best, is the process by which social movements gain traction. That is a subjectivist approach to social problems. Here I give you the formal definitions of these words. I've already explained what these mean earlier in the slides, but you can read it here as well. Again, in a nutshell, an objectivist approach to social problems postulates that social problems naturally arise and that social movements emerge as a way to combat them. Whereas a subjectivist approach says that, yes, objective events occur, but they're not objectively social problems. They have to become defined as issues first. And that process of definition shapes what can be considered appropriate action to take. Here are the steps in the social problems process. We're not going to cover all of them in this PowerPoint in detail, mainly because a lot of these, well, they're intuitive enough. There are many pieces and many parts to each of these steps that we could go over, but there's 2 major parts that are more complex and more interrelated to a lot of the other things we learned this semester. So those are the 2 that we're going to focus on. But all of them need to be known and understood, so make sure you learn all of these. But the steps to creating a social problem are first claims making. That's making a claim that something is a problem in short form. There's a lot more to this, but that's the gist. The second step is gaining media coverage and the way that media coverage frames a problem to appeal to public sentiments. The third is the public's reaction to that. So once the media has picked up a social issue and packaged it for the public, then the public has to react appropriately in order for that issue to gain further traction. After that, at this point, if the issues gain sufficient traction, policies need to be put in place. So policy making is the next part of the process. And then finally, social problems work. Social problems work is the everyday interactional work that we do in order to continually reify, to continually define and redefine the social problem in order to keep incorporating it into our dominant culture. And we do this by taking actions to resolve the issue on a personal level. So one way to think about this is imagine a social worker, right? A social worker has to deal with a number of different social problems, like the problem of homelessness. A social worker might refer someone who's having trouble gaining a permanent residence to a place where they can gain temporary residences or help them to gain a permanent residence. That is work that is done in order to remedy homelessness as a social problem. But notice first that we have to define homelessness as a problem for any of that to happen. If society decided that homelessness was not a social problem, if we didn't talk about homelessness as if it were a problem, if instead it were just treated as a normal part of everyday life, that sometimes people end up without homes and we might think that's terrible, but we didn't talk about it as being a social problem worth documenting, worth working on, then under this approach, it would never become a quote-unquote social problem. It would just be a personal problem. Now, that's not the only way social problems work can happen. Social problems work can happen in our daily lives. Take the example of alcoholism. Alcoholism is something that we consider to be a social problem today. That is not coincidental, and that's not just because there's an objective problem out there of people being addicted to alcohol. Yes, that happens. But it becomes a social problem when claims makers say, hey, we are advocating on behalf of people who are addicted to alcohol, or we want to say that this is a social problem, that alcoholism is one of the things that plague society, and then as a result of that, a social movement emerges in order to define what is alcoholism, what are appropriate steps to take to combat it, and so on. In fact, alcoholism is relatively new. The movement that preceded alcoholism as we currently defined it had attached to it a completely different name for this social problem. It was just referred to as being a drunkard or a rake. Prior to 1920, before Prohibition, a movement was started in order to push for Prohibition. A lot of the leaders of this movement were women who were concerned about men coming home drunk and being violent. It was framed as a domestic abuse issue, among other things. But it was framed as a social problem. Religion was also related, right? This had to do with pietistic Protestant ideals. But the social problem itself was defined as a problem of personal restraint. If a person was a drunkard, then they had a moral issue. Today, when we talk about alcoholism, though, we talk about it using a medical terminology. We frame it as a medical issue. It is a kind of addiction. It is a kind of disorder, right? We use the terminology associated with mental disorders as opposed to disorders of character today. So, what does this have to do with social problems work? Well, it means that in our daily lives, if we meet someone who is consuming alcohol in what we think are unhealthy quantities, prior to Prohibition, the kind of social problems work that would have taken place would be individuals would reprimand someone who was drinking too much and tell them, you know, you are a drunk, you are irresponsible, you have an issue of character. And that would be a way of advancing the social issue, continuing to impress upon each other that this was a real problem, and to reinforce the idea that this is the correct kind of solution, right? And whatever effect that had on reducing alcoholism or not, you know, that work was aimed to do that, and certainly that had some kind of effect, right? That was social problems work. It reified the social problem, and it reified the correct kinds of decisions and behaviors that were needed to fix it. So today, if you wanted to engage in social problems work, and you knew someone who was, that you believe were over-consuming alcohol, probably you would do social problems work that aligned with the current framing of alcoholism. You would say things like, you know, we're worried about you. Have you considered seeing a doctor? Maybe you should go to a therapist, right? We would suggest medical treatments as if it were a medical problem rather than attacking a person's character. So that's how social problems work works. It's the day-to-day interactions and the individual things that we do to affect a social problem. In order for a social movement forming group to start their work, the first thing they have to do is engage in this process called claims making. We've already stated that claims making means making a claim, saying that there's something that is a social problem. But it's not just as simple as this. Claims making is the process of building that argument on the basis of grounds. Grounds are just reasons to believe that the social problem is indeed a social problem. you can think of it as arguments, but it's more than just arguments. It's arguments that are backed by, yes, evidence, that is important, but more than just evidence. It's backed by things that appeal to the dominant culture, things that appeal to a listener in a way that tells a story, a compelling story of a social issue that's pervasive and relevant to the listener. Something that's going to create that social reality and reify that problem. So grounds are reasons. It's another way of saying reasons to believe a social problem claim is indeed true, right? So here's a few examples of claims making grounds. One is a typifying example. So groups may, when they're making their claim that something is a social problem, produce some kind of example as a way of illustrating their social problem. And this is known as a typifying example. So an example of this. So civil rights activists have, for as long as the civil rights movement has had traction, made the argument that there is bias in police shootings. And we have data that backs that up. We've talked about it in class. There's a great deal of evidence that shows that this is the case. But when civil rights movement activists want to make their claim that this is a problem, one of the grounds that they're going to want to produce for that is a typifying example. By highlighting one example of the social problem, one illustrative case, an anecdote, it brings that claim to life in a way that's going to mobilize people more than simply saying that this might be true, right? Well, I wouldn't say more, but it helps. Let me put it that way. It's not that it's better evidence. All forms of evidence make for excellent grounds, but this is a particular type of ground that serves that function by telling that story. So one example from a modern sort of civil rights perspective, like modern movements that are the Black Lives Matter movement, specifically the Black Lives Matter movement, which is kind of a modern civil rights movement in its way. They use the typifying example of, well, there's several young black men that serve as typifying examples for that movement. Probably one of the more famous ones is Trayvon Martin, who was a 17-year-old kid who was shot and killed by police for committing no crime at all. The officer who shot him, George Zimmerman, this was in 2012, was charged with murder but was ultimately acquitted. Like is the case often in these shootings by police. Police frequently are not given severe sentences or are not sentenced at all. But this particular typifying example really resonated morally with black communities, and so it was a powerful kind of typifying example. It highlighted a specific instance of this social problem in a way that got people interested. One quality that you can expect from typifying examples is that often they exaggerate the most important parts of the social issue. That's not to say that claims makers are doing the exaggerating. It's that the stories that become really powerful claims are usually the most dramatic stories that build a picture that tells the most dramatic version of what's going on, so that people who hear that story will feel emotionally and personally mobilized to action, right? It'll highlight all the most, well, the word typifying has typical in its name, right? All the most relevant aspects of the social problem as possible that you can capture in just one story, right? So obviously, a lot of elements of the social problem are not going to be present in every single story, but by choosing a story that encapsulates as many of those most important parts of the problem as possible and highlighting that and focusing on it and telling that story, it becomes powerful. Another kind of grounds that a group will, that a social movement might use is naming the problem. Here I just wrote name, but naming the problem is the process of giving the social problem a relevant name, hopefully something that's catchy, that gives people a way to very quickly slice what's happening and create a quick shorthand explanation for what's going on. Some of the examples that Best gives are road rage, for example. Road rage is a way of naming a problem. Road rage is a relatively new term. It didn't really come along until the 1980s. There were a series of shootings that occurred on freeways in cities in Los Angeles, and claims makers started creating the idea of there being a social problem whereby people who are on the road will experience road rage. They'll get angry at other drivers, and it'll make them behave in irrational and violent ways, right? So that's a catchy name, and that is a social problem that, according to Best's subjectivist approach to social problems, didn't exist prior to the 1980s. Of course, people still got mad when they drove before the 1980s, and they still might have behaved violently, but it didn't become a quote-unquote social problem until it became highlighted. So naming the social problem is a kind of grounds. Statistic is another kind of grounds for social problems, and that is probably one of the more hard evidence kinds of grounds, right? By citing a statistic and saying that there is some specific quantity of people who are experiencing this, then we're actually providing some kind of data saying, yes, this social problem objectively exists in the world, right? Those are just some of the grounds. Best lists a series of additional grounds, but any kind of argument that something is a social problem, any kind of evidence that is presented for the social problem in any form counts as a kind of grounds. So what's relevant here is that grounds can be sourced in scientific hard data, or they can be sourced in emotions, or they can be sourced in this kind of storytelling format. All that matters is that you're producing some kind of rhetoric that is designed to convince your audience that the social problem exists, that it is a problem. Here are some of the additional grounds that Best presents. One is he calls worsening situation. So if a group is using the worsening situation ground, then what they're doing is they're saying that they're producing rhetoric to suggest that the problem exists and that it is progressively getting worse over time. Claims makers who say that violence in video games is causing violence among youths might say this problem has been getting worse and worse over time. Look at how there have been increases in school shootings, and also how video games have been getting more and more violent as the years go by, right? Worsening situation. Another that they might use is familiar type of problem. So in this case, what claims makers will do is they'll compare the social problem that's happening here to other kinds of social problems that we're already familiar with and that the public has already accepted as a social problem. So I gave the example of alcoholism earlier. Alcoholism, one thing that claims makers will do who advocate for us to believe that alcoholism is a current social problem is they'll use that rhetoric that compares it to a medical issue, to an addiction, a disease, a disorder. By the way, I'm not saying that alcoholism isn't any of those things. There's certainly a medical aspect to alcoholism, right? And if folks struggle with that, then it makes sense to get help in the ways that society has framed that issue. What I'm highlighting here is simply that it is a kind of framing, right? And that when we use alcoholism and when we make claims about it being a problem and we compare it to other kinds of problems, one of the things we're doing to argue for this social problem, to advocate for others to see it as something that needs to be rectified, that is something that is unjust. We compare it to disorders so that it'll be more likely to be accepted by the public as an actual social problem, right? And it also might be like that kind of social problem. That might be true. So it's another thing that claims makers can do. Say it's a familiar kind of problem in some way. It's like something else that we already agree is a problem. Another kind of ground is by producing rhetoric concerning the kinds of people who are affected. Now, what does Best mean by the kind of people affected? Well, he's not just saying, oh, is it one person or is it another person? Is it women or is it men? Is it people of this status or that status? What he's saying with kinds of people affected is he's saying that we will, as part of our grounds, frame those who are affected in particular ways. For example, as villains or as victims, right? So if someone is a victim of domestic violence, we use that term that they're a victim, right? We say the social problem exists, domestic violence. We could easily imagine a society where domestic violence was not considered a social problem, where it was considered a normal part of everyday life. Again, I'm not advocating for that in the slightest. Domestic violence does happen, and it is unjust, and I will, in this moment, advocate for us considering it a social problem, right? But Best is simply saying that this is how we make it something that becomes addressed, right? How we make it a social problem proper, right? And one of the ways we do that is by showing through maybe typifying examples or through our arguments that those who are affected, by portraying them as victims, portraying them as someone who is not responsible for what happened to them, and portraying the perpetrators as villainous, right? That they have had some kind of character trait that is problematic, that they have created a victim, right? Another kind of ground is by talking about the range of people affected. Here, claims makers may try to create arguments to say that this problem is going to affect a broad range of people in order to get listeners to personally feel threatened by this social problem and to understand that this social problem can strike at anyone, right? So, for example, let's say that there was a social movement that was trying to combat against child abductions. So child abduction does happen, right? They might claim that a broad range of people are affected. They might claim that child abductions happen at random, that you never know who it is. It could be your neighbors, it could be your friends, it could be a stranger across the street. You never know who it's going to be. And so by saying something like that, essentially what you're doing is you're appealing to the listener and saying, you could be affected by this. This is a personal issue to you, so you should care about it. Finally, the last kind of claims making ground that Best talks about is challenges to older interpretations. So I already gave the alcoholism example, right? An older interpretation of alcoholism was it's a character trait problem, you're a drunk. Current interpretations are you have a disorder, you have an alcohol addiction. Completely different, right? It calls for different kinds of actions. The example that Best gives in the book I actually really like too. In the past, poor student performance, well, this is still the case today, but often that is treated as a social problem by itself, and it is framed as a problem of character, where someone is simply has poor character if they're performing poorly in school. Today, we have a number of different claims that have been put out by different claims makers that challenge those older interpretations. Claims about learning disabilities is a really good example, right? That a student may be performing poorly in school because they have a learning disability, and so that frame will be produced. We've also talked a lot about inequity, right? So inequity frames or claims, right? Grounds, those versions of the social problem also challenge that, right? A student may not be performing poorly at all. It may be that they're being treated unfairly by their instructors on the basis of race or gender, or some other form of inequity that exists in the school system or in the dominant culture, right? You're learning about that right now. I am a claims maker because I'm making claims on behalf of the sociological community, right? On behalf of academics. So that's another kind of grounds. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to watch a video clip. So this is a video clip from the 90s. I can't say to what degree these claims are still being made and are prominent in the dominant culture, but you are all members of the dominant culture, so perhaps among you, as you communicate with each other, you can tell from your common experience just how popular this claim is. But anyway, we're going to watch a video that makes a claim that a certain social problem exists. And you'll be able to tell the video is fairly old because it is from the 90s. But it doesn't really matter the age of the video. What matters is that you all, what I would like you to do is to watch this video, get out a little piece of paper just to scratch down some notes, and I want you to think to yourself, what are the claims that are being made in the video about a social problem, and what are the grounds? So I just listed a bunch of different grounds, and I described how they worked. Look for typifying examples, look for naming the problem, look for statistics concerning who the problem affects, Look for a worsening situation. Is that in there? Do the claims makers claim the situation's getting worse? You know, do they claim it's a familiar type of problem? Do they make claims about who could be affected, the range of people affected? Do they challenge older interpretations to similar problems by saying the problem is of a different nature from how we previously talked about it? Look for those, and look for other kinds of grounds too. Look for whatever reasons the claims makers in this video are giving to convince us that this social problem is real, and just kind of make a note to yourself how you think that works. Okay? All right, so we're going to do this as practice. This will give you an opportunity to start thinking to yourself, how can I identify these things in the real world when I see them? Okay, on this slide I'm just explaining the activity that I just explained to you that we're going to do, but it looks much cleaner on this slide, see, because it's all in one box and there's the instructions at the top, and I've got the nice little list there of all the different kinds of grounds that you can look for. So if you like, you can jot this down on a piece of paper, all the types of grounds that you're looking for, or you can just admire how nice and organized this slide is. All right, but enough of that. Let's watch the video clip.
With so many parents packing their kids off to college right now, it's natural for both sides to feel a little separation anxiety. But Chris Conley's been following a new phenomenon: mothers whose apron strings reach all the way to college dormitories. From doing laundry to wake-up calls, they're confusing letting go with never can say goodbye.
It's a new school year, and that means college kids are about to learn a big lesson from their techno-savvy parents. You can run, but you can't hide.
Dad, cool it with the Twitter updates, okay?
I'm sitting on the patio.
I know you're sitting on the...
As these Verizon ads spoof, media-mad moms and dads are texting, tweeting, even friending their college freshmen on Facebook, eager to stay close to their kids long after the minivan has pulled away from the dorm. Those who felt the power of parental omnipresence include Ethan Lewis and his brother Brendan.
Hello?
Hi. How was poli-sci this morning?
Mom?
Hey, I just got your email. Hello, Bren.
Hey.
How did the human geography quiz go? Hi, Ethan.
Hey, what's going on?
You don't have class on Thursday at 1 o'clock?
Hello?
Hey.
Hello?
Hey.
Hello?
Are you having trouble with the phone?
No, I had it on vibrate.
You should take it off vibrate unless you're in class so that you can hear me.
Robin Lewis is a single parent who homeschooled her sons. And just because Ethan and Brendan are out of the house and she's taken on a full-time job, that doesn't mean she's losing interest or hour-by-hour involvement in her boys' lives. Every single day, like this one.
Hi, Ethan. It's Mom. It's 9:10, and I know you have class at 9:30.
Later, she makes another call to Ethan.
Hi, Ethan.
Hey, what's going on?
I'm good. How you doing? Did you just get out of class?
She checks an email from Brendan.
History quiz is going to be on the first 13 chapters.
Sends an email to Ethan with his fall schedule.
105.
Makes another call to Ethan.
What are you doing this afternoon?
I have to meet some people at 5.
Socially?
No, studying.
Oh, a study group?
Study group, yeah.
Then she calls Brendan.
Are you going to be able to get that math thing for me?
I'm gonna do that today. Like, I have a few things that
Well, why don't you call me after human geography and let me know how the quiz went?
All right, we'll do.
Your American Lit class, because it goes to need to register.
When she's not talking to her boys,
and you're doing so much. And
Robin's organizing their lives. She spends an hour drafting to-do emails for her sons,
he did so well on
checking their grades,
98 out of 100 on his history essay.
checking their bank accounts,
And it looks like Brendan's going to need a few dollars for the weekend.
even using their personal passwords to check their student email.
Something about a conference reminder.
Her tools of the trade include this stuffed purple folder.
I've made notes that he's going to be graded on 10 quizzes, a book review, 1 exam, midterm final, and I even check off each week as we go.
Even a dedicated cell phone just for the boys' calls.
And this is the hotline. One of the boys calls me at 10:20, and I can say to them, wait a minute, you can't be calling me now. You're supposed to be in history class. And then they'll go, oops.
Robin works tirelessly to keep those oops to a minimum. She proofreads her son's papers at lunch. And Brendan and Ethan both say they're grateful for their mom's efforts on their behalf.
She wants to make sure that I do it well, and it's all because, she cares. which is great because, you know, then it's like I don't have to make a list and I can just print it out and it's there. So it saves me a lot of time.
In the wellness dorm?
It's nice to have someone else that's kind of serves as maybe a secretary mom.
One of your sons, I think, referred to you as like a secretary mom.
Well, I think that's great. It means that I'm very organized. Would that be ready by Saturday? You know, a secretary helps to keep the boss focused and organized, right? We don't know how to balance much of our lives yet when we're 18.
No one could deny Robin loves her sons and wants them to succeed. Not everyone thinks that she's helping them.
I can understand why a parent would think I'm just doing what I think is right for my son or daughter. The problem is they're doing exactly what's wrong for their son or daughter.
Helen Johnson, author of the book Don't Tell Me What to Do, Just Send Money, is a consultant on parental relations for some of America's top universities. She says parents like Robin are far too involved in their children's lives.
In taking over, they are sending a profound message. You are not capable of handling your life.
Financial aid office.
Helen Johnson is more than familiar with the term in vogue to describe someone like Robin, a helicopter mom.
A helicopter mom is a mom who hovers over every stage in her child's development, from basically now in utero through the college years and beyond.
Administrators say helicopter moms and dads have become a campus phenomenon. To harness the influx of eager parents, 96% of colleges now have orientations designed just for mom and dad. 70% of schools have so-called parent coordinators. Some campuses have even added Hi Mom cameras, where parents can hover from thousands of miles away. But Robin Lewis says she doesn't hover, she helps. She even drives 2 hours to Ethan's dorm and twice a month does his laundry.
Did you check all the pockets? Make sure nothing's in the pockets?
She shops for his groceries.
Wow. Looks like I have a lot of cleaning to do.
Picks up his dorm room. She even does the dishes. Isn't it time for him to say, yeah, I don't like it like this, I'll clean it up, or to live that way?
And he'll tell me that. He'll tell me that. I think that's probably more coming from me, that I just want to tidy up. We don't need any green tea.
Robin is justly proud of the artistic and intelligent children she's raised.
She's like the most selfless person on the face of the planet. I mean, she just, you know, will give and give and give and give and give. And when she's, you know, got nothing left to give, she'll keep giving. I know you've done it all before. She has succeeded in every aspect of giving my brother and I everything a kid can ask for.
But for Robin, letting go can be the hardest thing of all, because the lists and the calls don't just help her sons, they help her stay close to them.
These habits are very hard to break, and I know I'm still doing them. I'm trying to wean them off more and more so that they can become more self-reliant.
But you don't want to do that, do you? You want to talk to them 3 times a day. You want to make the to-do lists. You want to read their books. You want to read their papers.
I want them to be able to become their own person as long as we stay close. And I don't want to feel that all of this, you know, micromanaging mothering crippled them in any way to not be able to relate to other people.
In fact, Robin says her relationship with her sons has evolved from constant monitoring to close friendship. Ethan, she says, dropped out to pursue a career in music. Brendan, armed with a degree with honors in global studies, is traveling the world. Robin believes her parenting style has made her sons uniquely independent. Yet she still emails, IMs, and calls, and knows that one day she'll face an even greater separation.
Together again. And of course, when they get married, you know, that I'm not going to be the most important person there, and I know that. Of course I know that.
You know it, but how does it feel?
You go through a period of withdrawal, and then hopefully you get to be best friends with their wife, and you have a good relationship, and then she'll call you and tell you what he's doing.
All right, so hopefully while you were watching that, you were able to establish a number of different grounds and warrants that were being used in order to advocate for the existence of that social problem in that video. I will leave that to you, but we'll be discussing that more during this unit. And you'll be having more opportunities to apply those examples. Remember what you wrote down. We'll be coming back to that. All right, so moving on, we're going to talk a little bit about media coverage. So what we just watched was a kind of media coverage, right? We watched how the claims makers in that video were making their claims and how they were supporting their claim. Part of the way that was being supported, though, was through the media. So the people who were originally making the claim weren't necessarily the media who was showing the story. The people showing the story certainly bought that claim, but buying into that claim does not make them part of the initial social movement that started advocating for the issue to become a social problem, right? So in order for the issue to get that media leverage, the media takes a number of steps in order to legitimate a certain kind of groups, a certain kind of social problem that a group is advocating for. And this work, this labor that goes into creating a social problem through the media is known as news work. So these are the methods that media producers use to determine how the news will be presented. News work requires those who control the media to take a number of different things into account. These are sort of like steps. They don't apply to every single thing that the news presents necessarily, but they dominate what is covered in the news, right? These factors are key to creating a story that the dominant culture is going to find plausible, and they are key to the success of a news network that wants to broadcast those claims, right? These are the factors they need to take into account. Firstly, the media is going to look for stories that have some amount of novelty. A social movement that wants to market itself to the news. That's another thing, is that social movements will generally be more successful if they can frame their claims in ways that the media can easily package and present to their audiences, right? Now, being able to get the eye of the media, it helps to have something novel to say in your social movement. Now, this is tricky, of course, because as a social movement goes on, the claims that they make don't really change. So getting that media interest is more difficult. More creative means need to be come up with in order to make the stories that you produce continually novel. Different kinds of protests, different kinds of demonstrations, different kinds of events that are being held, maybe new claims or new ways of repackaging old claims. But as the media, the process that they undergo is they look for stories that have some level of novelty. They also look at the degree of public interest in a given issue. In other words, to what degree do they think that their audiences, whichever audiences that they're trying to appeal to, are going to be interested in this social issue in a way that it personally affects them. Another thing they're going to want to take into account are the qualities of the news medium. Stories that are in print and stories that are broadcast over television or through streaming news are going to have different implications for what the news medium is capable of showing and what is going to spark interest in an audience. So, for example, in television news, early television broadcasts of news were something that probably we wouldn't find very interesting today. The very first broadcasts were just news anchors reading off the news. Broadcasters discovered quickly, however, that people would soon get bored of this, and they wouldn't be able to hold their audience's attention. So instead, if the news medium is a visual news medium, like television or streaming internet news, then they're going to want to produce visuals to go along with what they're saying. So for this reason, you'll sometimes notice that news stories that cover similar issues might have similar images attached to them. And if you pay attention to the news, you'll often find that the visuals that are being represented don't actually necessarily produce a lot of new information. Often they do, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just for the sake of creating an interesting visual to keep the audience engaged. That means, however, for a social movement that if they're trying to appeal to a very visual medium, that by creating a very visual demonstration of their social problem, they're going to be more likely to capture the news's attention, right? So a very visual protest where something active and interesting is happening is going to be much more likely to capture or to gain the attention of television news media than, say, a talk or a lecture or a debate, right? So, for example, when I was an undergraduate in college, one of the things that a local secular group would do, so an atheist advocacy group, is they would have a so-called quote-unquote Stone a Heathen Day. What they would do is they would go out in the summertime and get a bunch of water balloons, and then one person would stand up to be the designated heathen, and then they would encourage passerby to grab a water balloon and throw it at the heathen. And then while they were doing this, they might ask for donations or just tell people about the group and invite them to come. And it would capture the interest of more people on campus because it was a very active medium. And activities like this would be much more likely to get the attention of the campus newspaper. And at one point, they actually did get the attention of a broader news. They never got cameras on them, but there was a newspaper article about them. I don't remember all the details, but the point is that a demonstration that's very visual like that and interactive is much more likely to capture the attention of a news medium that's very visual, right? Whereas if they held a debate, which was another thing they would do on campus, hold religious debates with all the various groups on campus together, that would be much more likely to be reported on in a newspaper or something, a local campus newspaper or whatever. And those mediums would carry across those arguments more compellingly, and news producers of that media would be more interested in attending those events. So from the position of the claims makers, it makes sense for them to tailor their presentation to the news medium. Another thing that the people who sort of construct the news want to take into account is their target audiences. So here I have highlighted wealth in particular. So this is more relevant for larger social movements than my example of a atheist group on campus. When the news is being broadcast, their target audiences for their information is more likely to be wealthy people, just because those are people with more power and influence, and they're also going to be people who are more likely to be consuming that media because they have access to the technology and resources in order to do so. So claims makers that make claims that invoke a sense of urgency in people who have more wealth and have more resources are more likely for that reason to get the attention of the media. And the media, in turn, is going to seek movements that will capture the interest of those demographics. Wealth isn't the only thing that's important, though, and that's because of this other piece of media coverage called audience segmentation. One of the things that the news will do is they will, rather than simply present stories broadly based on relevance to everyone, rather, and this isn't just for the news, this is for popular culture media, any kind of media that's going to capture, that's going to take this, that this claim might appeal to, that this social problem might appeal to, is still relevant, right? So, for example, say there was a very popular sitcom or a reality television show. That reality television show might incorporate themes from the culture that are related to a social movement just as easily as the news might, and this still works to the advantage or disadvantage of the claims makers because it gets their ideas into the dominant culture, it disseminates them. In both of those cases, whether it's news or whether it's a popular culture highlight, the producers of media engage in what is known as audience segmentation. So they're not going to just present something that's relevant to everyone necessarily, but instead they're going to find a target audience of one perspective, of one sets of viewpoints or culture or orientation, and then they're going to tailor what they show to what they believe that particular audience might be interested in. The easiest example I can think of off the top of my head is going to be the various news networks. Fox News is a conservative news network, openly conservative, whereas some of the other news outlets are, well, other news outlets are not conservative the way, to the degree that Fox News is, at least not many of them, not the mainstream ones, right? That's a form of audience segmentation. So the other broadcasting that's going to go on besides the news as well, that Fox puts out on those same networks, are going to be things that they think that that audience is going to find appealing, right? So that conservative audience, the age group that they expect to be seeing, to be watching those networks, if it's via television as opposed to online streaming news, then they can predict, for example, that their audience is going to be older on average, since younger people increasingly get their news from other sources, right? So having that understanding of what audience that they're going to be speaking to is going to influence what kinds of stories that they show and the way that they frame those stories. Another piece of news work is this concept of the professional standard of balance. News media will present an issue, usually, often, as having two sides when they present it. This is not inherently a good or bad thing, right? Stories often have multiple sides. But I said two sides specifically because news is often complicated intrinsically, but audiences can't digest an infinitely complicated story, and also the medium itself can't be broadcasting something that's overly long and complicated just by the sheer limitations of what they need to do. A newspaper can only have so many words, a television show can only have so many minutes. These issues need to be condensed and simplified, and one of the ways that that's done is by breaking an issue up into two sides rather than many sides and presenting each of those two sides. Sometimes even an issue in which there's very little debate about the quote-unquote truth of the issue will still be presented with two sides, simply because this presents an easy way to engage the audience and to make the issue look like something that is worthy of discussion and debate, right? So there's going to be, in an issue, that two-sided presentation is a theme that you see repeated over and over in the news media. The final thing that's part of news work is this issue of ownership of the problem. So ownership of the problem is something that isn't contained in the news itself, but that's something that the claims makers attempt to gain, or that the claims makers can attempt to establish someone else has. What ownership of the problem means is it means that there are certain people for a social issue who are assumed to have authority over what the nature of the issue is and what steps ought to be done. They have a say in the grounds and warrants associated with that issue. So in the case of mental health disorders, the people who have ownership of the problem are going to be mental health professionals. When it comes to medical problems, the people who are going to have ownership of the problem are usually going to be medical professionals. Take, for instance, the anti-vaccination movement. So for anyone who doesn't know, there is a movement that's been gaining traction a lot more recently, but it's been around for quite some time now, at least a decade, at least I'd say, where concerned parents believe that vaccinations are causing autism in their children. So I'm going to state for the scientific record, since this is a science class, as it were, a social science class, that scientists broadly, not just sociologists, but biologists and practitioners, doctors as well, do not believe that vaccines cause autism. There is no reliable scientific evidence that does that. The scientific community has not been able to produce any evidence to do so. The only studies that have produced an apparent outcome like that have been exposed as being studies that were motivated by a profit motive or otherwise, shady activities, I guess, for lack of a better term, that they were not legitimate scientific studies, that they were not using legitimate scientific methods. They've been broadly debunked. So I'm just going to go on the record and state that. But of course, form your own opinions. Don't believe me just because I told you to. I'm not presenting a full class on the anti-vaccination movement, so do your own research. Try to weigh the evidence yourself using your own free mind. I'm just stating that for the sake of the class, because I'm teaching from the perspective of academics. That's what the academics say. But take the anti-vaccination movement as an example of ownership of the problem. The anti-vaccination social movement generators, the people who are starting that movement, they want ownership of the problem. They want to be seen as the authorities. Or rather, I guess I shouldn't say them. They want the doctors, the researchers, the quote-unquote researchers that support their claims, the ones that the scientific community ostracizes and has, debunked their methods. They want those people to have ownership of the problem. They want to be able to say, we and they are authorities on whether vaccinations are healthy and okay or not. Whereas who currently owns the problem in the dominant culture as to the safety of vaccines are the doctors and biologists. They firmly own that problem in our culture, and this subculture is fairly fringe. Even though it's gained a lot of traction, it's still fringe. So when the news media presents a story, they have the ability to select who they're going to present as having ownership of the problem. And they can do that by highlighting experts. So if they were going to present a story on the anti-vaccination movement, they might show anti-vaccination movement advocates giving their position, but then they'll probably also have a doctor or a biologist or someone to present the professional opinion on the movement's claims. Are those claims warranted, right? So whoever the media highlights is someone who they're giving ownership of the problem to. A given news media outlet doesn't have to do that. They could choose to give ownership of the problem to someone else. So for another example of how the news media could subvert what the dominant culture usually designates as having ownership of the problem, another good example of this is the History Channel, a number of years ago now, produced at one point, and I think they might still produce shows like this, but they produced at one point, controversial is putting it lightly, documentary giving a whole bunch of people who were apparent professionals opinions on the existence of extraterrestrial life, claiming that they had a hand in building some of the earliest civilizations, that they helped construct the pyramids and that they helped build some other ancient cities, right? The professionals that they put in those documentaries were not in fact professionals. They're not people who the dominant culture considers having ownership of the problem. The dominant culture puts that very firmly in the archaeologists who study these cultures, right? But instead they give ownership of the problem to some people who did not have that kind of authority. They were instead people who were famous in these fringe movements, people who were famous for writing books on UFOs and aliens and so on, right? So here we have an example of the news media giving ownership of the problem to someone else, or trying to, right? Shifting that ownership, deciding how they're going to package their claim. So the key here is to just understand that in the dominant culture at any given time, one group usually has ownership of the problem, or at very least there's a kind of competition for that ownership. When a group does not have ownership, we say that they are dispossessed of ownership of the problem. So in the case of the anti-vaccination movement, that group is dispossessed. They do not have ownership of the problem, though they would like to. In the case of the social movement that advocated for alcoholism to be seen as a kind of addiction and disorder, they gained ownership of the problem, or rather they were able to give it to doctors and health professionals. So I've used this word packages a number of times. I said, how do news medias decide to package an issue? I used it before I gave you this definition of it. I debated for a little while in what order I was going to present these ideas, but it's a little bit tricky because they're all sort of bound up together. The package is what the media, how the media compiles these all ideas in order to give them to their audience, right? So a package is a way of describing an issue. It is a quote, this is a quote from Best, by the way, a familiar, more or less coherent view of a social issue. It includes causes as well as what ought to be done about the social problem. At its core, it contains frames. So we already talked about frames and what frames contain. A frame just being a way of explaining something in order to make sense of it, in order to give perspective on ways that are legitimate ways of talking about the issue and legitimate kinds of actions that can be taken about the issue. I gave that example of the classroom and the missing desks, and which ones are not. Another part of a package is a condensing symbol. Condensing symbols remind viewers of their meaning, right? All this means is that when the media presents a story, they are going to want to attach a very simple symbol to that story in order to invoke the meaning of that story quickly. We saw this in naming of the problem as well. So I talked about naming of the problem, and I gave the example of road rage. It's a catchy term to capture a concept, to capture an idea. That's not a package yet. That's a kind of that is a kind of a claim, right? Or grounds for a claim. Excuse me. That is one of the grounds for a claim, naming the problem. However, when the media wants to package that issue of road rage, they might choose a symbol that's also catchy. So they might show repeatedly images of infuriated drivers yelling at each other, or they might show angry men banging on windows of other cars with red faces screaming at each other or something. Or there might be something even simpler still. It might come to be the case that through a typifying example or something, maybe a famous story comes out about a case of road rage where a driver gets so angry that he shoots someone or something. Then we might see the same picture over and over again of the person who did that shooting. September 11th has a condensing symbol that I'm sure all of us have seen. The image of the airplane flying into the World Trade Center, right? With the two towers and the airplane going in and the explosion, right? That image is firmly burned into the minds of most Americans today. And it's a condensing symbol. It's a way of taking that whole story, that whole social problem, and all the things associated with it, and having it transmitted in a very simple way. So a media package can be disseminated for the same issue in very different ways. So when you're looking at a package, you want to ask yourself what package has become dominant. So in the 9/11 packaging, there is a very clear dominant package. We talk about the events of September 11th in fairly uniform ways. It's changed since the event happened. Right after 9/11, there was an extremely uniform packaging of the issue, that this is a problem of terrorism. Here's what terrorism looks like. Here's the people associated with it. Over time, the conversation has shifted, but not a lot. There's still a very dominant media packaging of the issue, right? There's a dominant media packaging of alcoholism that I described. So when you look at a package, think about what package has become dominant. So we watched that video a little bit ago about this issue of quote-unquote helicopter moms. Are helicopter moms a problem for America? So I'll give away a couple of, I guess, answers to some of the things that I asked you to look for when I was asking you to look for grounds. I'm not going to describe all of them because I want you to apply it to the issue yourself and think critically. But I will say that they did name the problem. That was one of their grounds. They called it helicopter moms. They gave a typifying example. They showed in a specific story about a specific young man and his mom and what their relationship was like. But that was part of that package. That could have been packaged in completely different ways. It could have been packaged as modern technology is causing people to behave in ways that they never have before. Modern technology is causing parents to become overprotective of their children. So that wasn't the package. The package that we saw was there's a problem of a character trait whereby moms are being overprotective and it is a problem with their personal self, right? It could just as easily have been a problem of modern culture. Modernity is coming, and now we have the internet, now we have email. As you saw, it was an old clip. Everyone was using old phones, and you saw the emails that the mom was sending, and that they all looked very quaintly old-fashioned already, which is kind of bizarre. But yeah, so all the more so for them. They could have said, hey, with the advent of the internet is causing our kids to be overprotected. They did not. Instead, they said moms are causing our children to be overprotected, right? So a landmark narrative is a typifying example that dominates the media's coverage of a social problem. So a typifying example, we already talked about Trayvon Martin with the Black Lives Matter movement, right? But a landmark narrative dominates the media's coverage, so that would count as both in that case. So it was both a typifying example. That typifying example became, through the news media, a landmark narrative. Now in the case of the helicopter moms, that typifying example that they showed us in that story did not become a landmark narrative, because if the media covered that social problem again, you can bet that the news story they showed you would not have that same young man and that same mom, right? It would have different families entirely. Whereas if you saw more coverage of the Black Lives Matter movement, you might still see people talking about Trayvon Martin, because that was a very strong typifying example, or some of the other young men who have been shot. There have been many who have become strong typifying examples, and many of them have become landmark narratives. A movement can have several landmark narratives. But just because something's a typifying example doesn't make it a landmark narrative. That depends on the media, and the media putting that into a package. So when a typifying example becomes part of a package, and when that becomes so powerful that it is routinely packaged that way by the media as the social problem is brought up again and again, then we call that a landmark narrative. All right, now we're going to apply these issues to some more news stories and some more videos. So we already looked at helicopter moms. This next issue we're going to look at is the modern climate change movement. Specifically, as of about a year ago, there was a series of all of the world students walking out of classrooms to protest climate change. Very young students, teenagers, as young as 13, 14, 15. Leaving their classrooms, and it became national news. It became a very, it was very influential. It was a very influential movement. These claims makers made a powerful case, such that, you know, it was reported on very widely. It had large impact. But the media didn't all package this issue the same way, as you might expect, in fact, because our media is so polarized. Conservative news media outlets packaged the issue of these student walkouts in a way that was radically different from the way other news media portrayed these walkouts. So we're going to watch both. First, we're going to see a video of the largest of the landmark narratives. The typifying example, I mean, this is all three. It's sort of a typifying example, and it's a condensing symbol, and it's a landmark narrative. What am I talking about? This is Greta Thunberg. So she is a student in Sweden who started, well, she didn't start, she was one of the people who was, who started the student walkout. So she was a very powerful player, right? Young girl, I can't remember her age, something like 14, 15. They might say it in the video, and I just can't remember, but we'll see it in a second. But she's spoken in front of world leaders twice, most recently at the UN Climate Action Summit. We're not going to watch that one. We're going to watch another video of her speaking. This was at the UN plenary session last year. Forgive me for not pronouncing her name correctly, by the way. I cannot pronounce her name because it is a Swedish name, but we're going to hear the correct pronunciation in a minute. But first, we're going to watch that. We're going to watch her first talk, where she becomes established in the media as a typifying example of a student who's doing these walkouts, as a kind of condensing symbol. Now the media knows that this is the face of that movement, right? Then after that, we're going to watch two news stories separately covering those student walkout protests. One from Rolling Stone, and then one from from Fox News. And you're going to see that the packages are very, very different, and then we're going to compare them. And this time I'm going to give you the well, I'm going to tell you sort of quote-unquote the answers. In the first example, I didn't want to tell you the answers because I wanted you to do it on your own. I have faith in you all to apply course concepts to that situation, and I think you're going to be better critical thinkers for it, doing it yourself rather than just watching it in this presentation. It's a good exercise. You should do that on your own. But this time I'm going to explain it because I think my explanation will only really make sense in light of having seen it. So whereas in the previous case, it would be easy for you to just skip forward and kind of get the answers, and then you wouldn't be able to think for yourself, which would be not good for your learning. You must learn to apply things on your own. It will make you smarter. At least it did for me, I hope. But anyway, this time we're going to watch these two stories, and then we'll do a breakdown. We'll explain what was it that we saw in each of these that made them different packages. Why does that matter? Okay, so let's watch those two clips, and then let's compare.
We are going to end today with the words of 15-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg, who addressed the UN plenary session last night.
My name is Greta Thunberg. I am 15 years old, and I'm from Sweden. I speak on behalf of Climate Justice Now. Many people say that Sweden is just a small country and it doesn't matter what we do. But I've learned that you are never too small to make a difference. And if a few children can get headlines all over the world just by not going to school, then imagine what we could all do together if we really wanted to. But to do that, we have to speak clearly, no matter how uncomfortable that may be. You only speak of green, eternal economic growth because you are too scared of being unpopular. You only talk about moving forward with the same bad ideas that got us into this mess, even when the only sensible thing to do is pull the emergency brake. You are not mature enough to tell it like it is. Even that burden you leave to us children. But I don't care about being popular. I care about climate justice and a living planet. Our civilization is being sacrificed for the opportunity of a very small number of people to continue making enormous amounts of money. Our biosphere is being sacrificed so that rich people in countries like mine can live in luxury. It is the sufferings of the many which pay for the luxuries of the few. The year 2078, I will celebrate my 75th birthday. If I have children, maybe they will spend that day with me. Maybe they will ask me about you. Maybe they will ask why you didn't do anything while there still was time to act. You say you love your children above all else, and yet you are stealing their future in front of their very eyes. Until you start focusing on what needs to be done, rather than what is politically possible, there is no hope. We cannot solve a crisis without treating it as a crisis. We need to keep the fossil fuels in the ground, and we need to focus on equity. And if solutions within this system are so impossible to find, then maybe we should change the system itself. We have not come here to beg world leaders to care. You have ignored us in the past, and you will ignore us again. We have run out of excuses, and we are running out of time. We have come here to let you know that change is coming, whether you like it or not. The real power belongs to the people. Thank you.
You've just been listening to 15-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg addressing the UN plenary last night. She has called for a global school strike on Friday. That does it for our show. A very special thanks to Democracy Now!'s Mike Burke and John Hamilton and Sam Alcoff and Libby Rainey. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks so much for joining us.
Our government has not invested what is necessary to protect our country from the climate crisis. No matter what you're feeling today, if it's anger, if it's anxiety, if it's frustration, just know that this is how we win. When we keep at it, when we keep organizing, when we keep pushing until they cannot ignore us.
Climate change is not a lie! We won't let our planet die! Climate change is not a lie! We won't let our planet die!
I'm very angry because world leaders have done nothing to make sure that my generation is growing up in a habitable planet. My name is Alexandra Villaseñor. I'm a 13-year-old climate activist, and I've been on school strike for climate in front of the United Nations headquarters for 18 weeks now. My earliest moment of becoming conscious of climate change was last November. So when visiting family in California, the fire broke out. My family is only an hour away from Paradise, so we got a lot of the smoke. When I think of my future, I'm most scared of how it's unpredictable. My generation will have the most extreme weather. We will continue to run from the next wildfire, hurricane, that we won't have time for school anymore. That's why school striking is so symbolic. When people from the United Nations come out to talk with me, most of them just show their support, ask how they can help, but then also talk about climate change, about their climate grief, and we talk about our climate anxiety together. I've been going inside the United Nations for a couple of engagements. I was at the EcoSoc Youth Forum.
Negotiating even before most of our generation.
And I was also invited into a couple of their roundtables for the Climate Summit and some of their special debrief meetings.
Like Greta said, everyone is welcome, everyone is needed. And so
in this day and age, the most effective way to get change is by civil disobedience and taking direct action like striking, because a lot of the students who are striking are not of voting age yet. So striking is our only way to get our voices heard and be of influence.
The youth are mobilizing. We know what needs to happen to save our planet. We must reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and we must transition to renewable energy, and we must keep it in the ground.
I do not think mostly adults are taking the student strikers' message seriously yet, because 1.6 million students protested on March 15th and no laws and policies were made. We are still not being heard efficiently to the point where world leaders will act on climate change. We are still being theoretically patted on the head.
In showing and pursuing the most progressive energy agenda that this country has ever seen. That's right.
The reason we started Sunrise is because our politicians have utterly failed us. Some are taking millions of dollars from fossil fuel executives. Others just don't seem to have the spine to actually fight for the solutions that we need. And so we decided that we needed to create a movement of young people to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process.
Green New Deal! Green New Deal! Green New Deal!
For the past few decades, the debate about climate change has been the framing of like, oh, our grandchildren are going to suffer. And now those grandchildren are stepping up and we're saying, actually, we're suffering from the crisis right now and we're demanding a solution. Because if you don't actually provide a solution for us and the entire world, then we're going to be living in climate chaos. Probably the biggest moment was when Superstorm Sandy hit. It's something that's really hard to explain when you see your home city like completely devastated to the point where it's like the streets are dead, no one's outside, no one can use the subway, and to be a junior in high school and to see this entire city come to a grinding halt was really, really astonishing. I would say that the imagery is, it's not so much fear, it's hope. And that really is the difference that we're bringing to the table. We're not just calling attention to the crisis. We're not just saying, look at these wildfires, look at these floods. We're not just pointing to the crisis, we're also coming with solutions. Just look at how the Green New Deal resolution has totally shifted the debate on climate, right? Because now it's suddenly actually about climate policy. When before the November midterm elections, the climate debate was between the left, which was saying the crisis exists, and the right, which was saying it's a hoax.
I'm calling to ask Senator Schumer to support and co-sponsor a Green New Deal.
Young people don't really want to pick up the phone to call their politician, but they will show up in, droves of 20 or 30 and sit outside their office.
I'm a constituent of Senator Schumer's, and I'm calling to urge Senator Schumer to co-sponsor the Green New Deal resolution. Direct action has a long history of creating change. At Sunrise's founding, we did a deep dive into the historical context of the situation that we were in, but it also meant a deep dive into social movements, what made them successful and what made them not work.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on? Chuck, which side are you on?
Direct action is a little bit of a lifeline, a call for help, a way to show how dire the situation is and how few options we have to actually fight this. A lot of people are looking for community, and they're looking for other people like them or not like them, but looking to do something exciting to make an impact. And a lot of times it's risky and it's scary, but seeing that other people are doing it too, and knowing that it's actually okay to feel scared, because it's not super typical to have to do this. It's not super typical to face a crisis that has been boiling and boiling for 30 years and you're the generation that has to take action. That's scary, and it's a lot of responsibility. But knowing that we can do it together and that it's important to act anyway, it feeds some sort of hunger in people that keeps them coming back again and again.
Just ring the bells that still can ring. There is a crack in everything. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. That's how the light gets in.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Millions of school children across America, and in fact around the world, skipped school today. They weren't playing hooky. They were instead participating in a coordinated left-wing political protest. It was called Climate Strike. So naturally, MSNBC was there to cheer them on.
New York City is the home base for these protests. School officials, public school officials, are allowing nearly 1 million students to cut classes.
Some of the signs, by the way, that I've seen so far for this rally are just absolutely fantastic.
Look, I am not in favor of encouraging people to skip class, but if there's a cause that isn't important, this is it. So good on you for going out there and telling people what really matters. Congratulations to you and those like you around the world.
Congratulations on skipping school. Throughout the day, news anchors assured their viewers that the strike was in fact being led by the kids. They were lying, of course. Like all activist movements, the climate strike was organized by cynical adults. Adults hoping to exploit children for political purposes, obviously. The other lie you heard today is that the strike was about the environment. It was not about the environment. The main goal of the protesters in this country, for example, was to implement Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's Green New Deal. You'll remember from just a few months ago that the Green New Deal is not about the environment. In fact, Ocasio-Cortez's chief of staff conceded as much. We're quoting now, "We really think of it as a how do you change the entire economy thing," end quote. But that shouldn't surprise you. The environmental movement itself has all but given up on the environment. Don't believe it? Look around. Is our country cleaner than it was? No. It's dirtier, and it's more crowded, and it gets more of both of those things every year. The left doesn't care. They're cheering it on. Why? Because they want power. And in climate change, they found an emergency big enough to justify grabbing more power. In fact, taking control of everything. Don't believe it? Check out the manifesto of Youth Climate Strike. That's one of the groups leading today's strike. The document calls for, among other things, state-owned banks, single-payer health care, affordable housing, expanded rights for sexual minorities, etc. Now, you may agree with those political goals or you may disagree. But what do they have to do with the environment? Obviously, nothing. But whatever, full speed ahead. Bernie Sanders, among others, is now demanding that the United States begin admitting what he calls climate refugees into our country, maybe in your neighborhood. That would include everyone south of Miami or north of Buenos Aires. All of them now have a right to move here because climate. So what are the chances of something like that passing Congress, you ask? Well, right around zero. Congress will never pass a law allowing that. And so that means in order to get what they want, progressives will have to bypass Congress, not to mention voters themselves. And they'd like to do that. Watch as Colorado Senator Michael Bennet explains that the main thing in the way of his climate agenda is, yes, democracy.
I think this is a test that's not well understood by some of the candidates in the race and has not been well debated, is our democracy up to this task? And that is a really non-trivial question. Because
I mean, it clearly isn't right now.
So far, we have not. We haven't been. And when you lose a national race, as we did in 2016, to a climate denier, that creates a real concern.
Is our democracy up to the task? If you're even asking that question, you're missing the point, because democracy is the point. But damn democracy, says the left, it's standing in the way of us getting control of every detail of your life. We'll have to do something about that. That is their position. In the meantime, though, the left has a backup plan. It's the same as it always has been: propaganda. Another demand of the Youth Climate Strike Group is what they're calling, quote, comprehensive climate change education. They want it for children aged 5 to 14. 5 years old? Why so young? Well, because, and again, we're quoting here, impressionability is high during that developmental stage, end quote. In other words, brainwashing is easier when they're little. And there you have the modern left's climate agenda. No drinking straws, no automobiles, no airplanes, no meat, no democracy. In their place, endless propaganda and a parade of 15-year-old red guards yelling at you to stay in line. That's what they're promising. All of a sudden, the future really does look bleak, and it has nothing to do with rising temperatures.
All right, before we start breaking down the packaging of each of these different news medias, first let's just give a quick summary of the claims makers, of the actual movement themselves, of the student protesters, not the media. Those claims makers are the student activists. Their grounds, they name the issue. They call it climate change. It wasn't a name that they came up with initially. Climate change movements have been around for quite some time, obviously, but that's the name. Their typifying example, Greta gives a number of different typifying examples, but any of the natural disasters that that student movements like this might cite constitute typifying examples. Statistics were not presented here, but climate change activists produce numbers surrounding record temperatures that are set regularly, almost every year. This year there were several, this year was the hottest year on record globally, and several records were set in various local regions. But yeah, and that's just one of the many statistics that are produced. Worsening situation. Greta and the other students stressed the idea that their choice to skip school for these protests is because they, quote, have no future unless climate change is addressed, right? So that is symbolic, one of the students said. The idea that why should they go to school if there's not going to be a future planet to live on? That statement is a worsening situation grounds, right? They're saying that our social movement matters on the grounds that we have a worsening situation that's going to affect a broad audience. There are more grounds in this, but I will leave that up to you. So I encourage you, go back, look at the different kinds of grounds that Bess talks about and that I mentioned. Look at the remaining grounds and see if you can think of how those other ones came into play during this video. I don't want to do all the work for you, but those matter. As for the warrants, what ought to be done for this issue, Greta indirectly challenges capitalism. She doesn't give a direct alternative, at least not in this speech, but you can look at some of the other issues that these student protesters are interested in, and some of the warrants that they produce. But here, in what we presented for class, we saw her talking about world leaders lining their pockets, right? So it's about making money. And she denounced their claims to continue with eternal green growth, right? So what she means by this is that world leaders believe that they can continue to grow the economy, even though she believes that that is unsustainable for the economy to keep growing. She says that this is impossible. So she's not directly using those words, but these are the kinds of warrants that you usually hear from groups that are challenging the capitalistic system and globalization broadly. That they're saying that she says that what we should be doing is pulling the emergency brake, right? Well, this is we have to treat this as an emergency. We have to stop what we're doing. This isn't just a matter of continuing to do what we do and changing things a little bit, right? Okay, so those are the grounds and warrants. Now let's get to the juicy part, the packaging. So we saw two packages of the same story, very different, right? First, let's talk about the Rolling Stones coverage of the issue, where we just saw the student protesters holding signs and so on. They had a frame, so every package starts with a frame. Their frame, the frame is stating what the problem is, the nature of the problem, to remind you. They state that the problem is the planet is experiencing an environmental crisis, right? And that these students, as a result, are going out to protest it. That's the frame. The planet is in crisis, and these brave students, you know, this is part of the frame too, is that they are, that they're building these students up. They're making them out to be heroes, right? And we talked about that too, that is one of the warrants, or one of the grounds that that social movements will do, that they'll identify villains and victims and so on. In this frame, those students are being framed as heroes, that they are heroes that are coming forth because the planet is in crisis. The cause of the problem is fossil fuel use and global warming, right? That the reason that there is climate disaster happening is specifically because of human activities. The landmark narrative here, the story that that is dominating everything, the condensing symbol as well. Greta and those students all over the world are skipping school to protest, right? So that story, that narrative, is the landmark narrative. They are a typifying example. They are a group that is come to do this, that the news media is reporting on over and over again. So you'll still find stories on this student movement and these protests when the media is talking about climate change protests. What ought to be done, according to this package, fossil fuel use should be stopped wholesale, right? That's what the students are saying, that we need to leave the fossil fuels in the ground, are her words. And the condensing symbol, one of the condensing symbols that this package uses, is children bravely confronting powerful adults. We saw that image over and over again, right? Of children talking to leaders in one form or another, and them being presented as these brave underdogs who are confronting these powerful men who run the world, right? At least that's what I'm claiming the condensing symbol is. You might be able to make an argument for another condensing symbol. You could say that it's Greta herself, that she is the condensing symbol. The point here is that you understand how a condensing symbol works, that it is a very easy, bite-sized piece of information that conveys what's happening. All right, in the second package, the Fox News package, we saw the frame was that the problem was not an environmental crisis at all. That was not the central issue. According to the Fox News package, the central problem in this story, where all these students are skipping class, is that liberals are manipulating children. Basically, this is a story about how the liberal political left is manipulating children into advancing their economic agenda, right? The cause of this is that liberals want more political power. They want to radically change the economy to suit their own best interests, which conservatives think will be to the disaster of the country, right? That liberals are greedily seeking power. They want to get that power. They're going to implement their agenda. It's going to hurt the country and it's going to benefit the liberals. That's the cause of this child manipulation. What they think ought to be done is preventing liberals from gaining power, and importantly, they think that the students should go back into class, that they should stop skipping class. The condensing symbol here, I have included the image that Fox News produced for this story that was sort of sitting behind the newscaster. I put it in this little corner here, that climate agenda image. But the idea here is that this symbol represents the, quote, brainwashed children holding these signs to advance what they believe is the leftist agenda, right? So that's their condensing symbol. So now when Fox News wants to report on that story, they can show these images of children holding up signs, skipping class, and that is going to capture the whole issue for them. That is going to package very neatly that same issue, so if it comes up again, they can do that, right? Okay, so now we've seen two very different packages for the same story. So what I want this to convey to you all is that claims makers, they can shape their claim in a way that's very similar to the way the media shapes claims. The difference is that the claims makers, when they do this, they're doing it in favor of their cause, in favor of their social movement. They're doing it as a group that's situated in that social movement. They're trying to establish their frame as being the frame the dominant culture will consume. The media can use that and incorporate it into their package, or they might not, right? And even when they do incorporate it into their package, they might package it differently than the way the protesters did. So those student protesters, they might object to a number of things that even the Rolling Stone presented on them. So, for example, they might object in some way to the condensing symbols that they're producing of young children standing up bravely to world leaders and not being listened to. I don't know why they would object to that. That makes sense to me that they would appreciate that. But maybe they wouldn't. Maybe, from their perspective, that was not the central issue and they didn't want the focus to be on them skipping class. They wanted the central focus to be on the climate issues that need to be addressed. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think that making those protests was part of getting that media attention and that was a good strategy from their perspective. But I'm just using that as an example. The point is that these packages are distinct. They're not the same as the grounds that the claims makers are making. This is a different entity creating a package. Okay. And of course, in the case of the Fox News story, it's very clear that it's a distinct package, that it's not the same as the claims makers. That's another reason I want to say that. I just want to make it clear that Rolling Stone is not the claims makers. These children are the claims makers. But Rolling Stone is the media. They produce a package. Fox News produced a package. So that should give you an idea of how packages can differ. All right, class, that's all I have for you today. Thank you, and I'll see you later.